Okay.
on the website, it says she's accepting.
Oh,
But this is how you
yeah.
say they're accepting patients, and then you call, can I make you so-and-so? Accepting patients, and I said, well, that's not how the website says.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I know, yeah. It's not
Trying to
cheap,
get
though.
it.
Yeah. You have what kind of insurance do you have?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you can't use that now.
Yeah, you can.
I hear other places are breaking up the United Healthcare to this because there's some problems.
I had a weird schedule this weekend. I actually went to St. Mary's this morning, and I got back to my house, and I was sitting down, and it popped up on my phone, Desiree lunch today. I said, gosh, I am flopped entirely. And then
I forgot.
Do you have time? You don't? We'll have to take a rain check.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Mary and I are going to go out and lunch anyway.
Yeah, there you go.
With you. Find somebody else.
Well, Renee wants me to help us with the setup,
Yeah.
the reception, and I wanted to just let you know.
You want to schedule an hour?
No, I don't have my phone. But another Sunday would be good if you'd like to do that. You know, actually, if I have you on my calendar today, but I haven't looked at my calendar. I see.
You don't have your phone with you, that's why I didn't hear you call me. That's all right.
Oh, you did call me? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm glad that I got it. I can talk to you now instead of just wondering.
I know.
I'll probably see you this afternoon.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mom and I talked about this. There's times of story about this. Still there?
I'm not very friendly.
Oh, there you are.
There, you go.
Sadly, just sort of this.
Oh, she's not going
She's not going to this thing. She's going to this thing.
Let's see, I'm not there. I'm actually in Port Ellis right now, but if you want to just leave, if you want to just leave them on the doorstep, that's fine too. Okay. All right, you too. Thanks. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
It was all Alice.
You going to the concert there later? Yeah. I want to see it. I think I'll come in on the second half.
Yeah.
Not sure how many hours of press recording is
Not seeing the lecture?
No, good lunch. Yeah. You can tell me more.
Ice machine.
I had one, the memory.
Travis
give it a couple more minutes and then we'll start. I know there was a pretty big line in the thing. Yeah, so the cool people are in here.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
Looking forward to your
Yeah.
So it kind of works, using so sad. You hear insurance? Part of it. So she actually had kind of ordered it.
Hi. Okay, how are you?
Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. Are you looking for your lovely wife?
Actually, I know she's gonna be meeting you.
I saw her earlier.
Oh, she's around somewhere. Maybe I'll peek to you again there.
Oh, it was really good. You should watch the video. I think they're,
Yeah, I didn't realize.
oh, thank you, I got you this.
That's
So I didn't know
hilarious.
you.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully this one will go a little smoother than this morning when an evil spirit possessed my computer and tried some exorcism to get it back on the path of righteousness. So last time I mentioned that while Ezra and Nehemiah had established reading the Torah as a fundamental spiritual activity, the Torah itself was not the only game in town. This is because, as we have learned, there were a great many different parties, sects, offshoots, factions, and so on. And they all used different texts to inform or justify their take on what it meant to worship God and to obey the commandments. This was either by creating their own texts, like the Essenes at the Dead Sea, or drawing upon a huge number of texts that were in circulation during this time. So there were different kinds of literature that served different interests. For example, there was prophetic literature, which predicted a future that could be avoided by good behavior. But we also see apocalyptic literature, which predicted an inevitable cataclysm that could be survived by good behavior, and so on. So what I want to focus on today is literature that offered critical teachings around which a godly community could coalesce and thrive. The Jewish people at this time were also very much concerned with not reprising the humiliation of defeat and exile and national bondage that they had experienced in Babylon. It forced people to consider and question why that had happened in the first place. This obsession with dangerous and even cosmically existential futures was understandable, given what the Jews had been through, extremely difficult circumstances as a nation. But not only had they managed to survive, they even briefly managed to win their national independence, and they did this without the benefit of a king or other conventional institutions of a traditional state. It turns out that the Torah that we have today was just one of a number of books or collections of books that sought to offer a way of living along with a vision of what was coming or what might be. And now I need to point out that these books were not necessarily intended to replace the Torah, so much as augment and perhaps update the Torah. They constituted a sort of dialogue among the texts. They also delve into questions about the nature of God and the role of God in the world that the Hebrew Scriptures don't really address. As such, this would be things like the role of evil or the origin of evil, why it exists in the first place. So we're going to consider 3 works today. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Temple Scroll from Qumran. Now obviously I cannot do justice to these 3 books in the time we have, but I want to give you a bit of a taste of what they are doing in the hope that it will spark your interest to look a little deeper into what they have to offer. And next time we'll talk about where you can read some of these things and access them. I will warn you, some of this is really, really weird stuff. It might feel like you're one secret handshake away from the next Dan Brown novel, but that's part of what makes them so interesting. They really do reflect a very different world. So we'll start with the Book of Enoch. This is a 16th century manuscript Ethiopic of the Book of Enoch. A quick note, there are 2 Enochs mentioned in Genesis. One is the son of Cain. The other, that's not the Enoch we're talking about here. The Enoch we're talking about here was an antediluvian patriarch. He was the 7th generation son of Adam and the father of Methuselah. This is probably one of the strangest of the intertestamental books. It's also the longest, weighing in at 108 chapters. It's also one of the more obscure books historically. It was at various times suppressed by both Christian and Jewish authorities. However, we have this book complete because it was preserved in Ethiopic by the Ethiopic Christian Church. That version was a translation from a Hebrew original into Greek, and then from Greek into Gez, or Ethiopic, the language of that church. Fragments have also survived in Syriac, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic. And for a long time, scholars regarded this as a Christian forgery until the discovery of the document hoard at Qumran. Several fragments of the Book of Enoch were discovered in Hebrew. And in fact, it was the second most widely represented non-biblical book found at Qumran. So when they compared the Hebrew with the Ethiopic version, it turned out that the translations matched up pretty well. So for this reason, we now know that Enoch is a pre-Christian book, and it is a Jewish book. It's also a composite. It's an assemblage of several works that have been skillfully edited together. Let's see. Okay, this is a Greek papyrus manuscript of Enoch from the Chester Beatty papyrus collection. It draws a parallel. It's both a parallel Pentateuch, but it also contains about a dozen apocalyptic visions that are probably drawn from other sources that we no longer have. And for that reason, it's also extremely important because it preserves these visions. The book is structured in 5 sections in order to follow the structure of the Torah, which gives it a semblance of Mosaic authority to a Jewish audience. Incidentally, the Gospel of Matthew does the same thing. It has 5 moments where Jesus does something significant. They are all on a hill, like Moses on the Mount Sinai. You have the Sermon on the Mount of Temptation, the Mount of Transfiguration, Calvary, and the Mount of Ascension. And a Jewish reader would look at that and go, oh, that's very Torah-ish, you know. So, anyway, unlike the Torah, though, it's not based on drawing lessons from the past. Its eye is on anticipating what's going to happen. It's looking to the future. So it's broken into these 5 sections. The Book of the Watchers is kind of a retelling of the story of the patriarchs in Genesis. The Book of Parables, or the Book of Similitudes, that's the one we're going to talk about today, where it has all these visions of what's going to happen, these apocalyptic visions. The astronomical Book of Enoch is one where an angel takes Enoch and sort of gives him a grand tour of the universe. Book of Dreams, Visions is pretty much like what it says, and then the Epistle of Enoch is where he kind of wraps it all up and pulls it all together. We could expend an enormous amount of time on Enoch, but it would probably require large quantities of magic mushrooms to do the job properly. One of the things that made it so controversial was that the Book of Similitudes in Enoch paints a very vivid picture of future events that include an overall vision of a very messianic future. We mentioned last time that Daniel was the earliest work that appears to hint at a messianic figure, this Son of Man person, which was kind of the first time we see it in the Hebrew Bible. Enoch spends a great deal of time and space attempting to make sense of this mysterious figure and what it might portend. And this speculation takes the form of all these heavenly visions in which an angel shows the author, Enoch, what's going to happen. The character of these visions is that's the main reason why scholars assumed it was a Christian forgery, because it looks an awful lot like Christian apocalyptic revelations type stuff. And at the same time, by the 5th century, almost all Christian authorities had rejected the book, simply stated, because it looked a little bit too Jewish. So what that really tells us is how close early Christian and late antiquity Jewish messianic thinking was. They were really very, very similar to each other, and a lot of partisans on both sides just were not comfortable with that. But it does emphasize how close they were at the very beginning. So we also learn something important about this book when we compare it to the Hebrew canon that was developed after the destruction of the Second Temple. As we noted last time, Daniel is very much an oddball book in the canon, but it's also noteworthy because it's really the only truly apocalyptic book in the Hebrew Scriptures. So from that fact, people have assumed that apocalyptic literature was unusual or not popular or just kind of out there and very fringy. But the Book of Enoch kind of blows that whole theory apart. It's not that there aren't other pseudepigraphic apocalyptic books besides Enoch. What we now understand is that Enoch was very widely read and studied. It was a very popular form of religious literature, but it was a form that the compilers of the Hebrew Scriptures made a great effort to keep out of the canon. Now, my personal conclusion, my personal speculation on this, is the reason they did this is that a lot of these apocalyptic works involved a great cosmic conflict of good versus evil and a war and a battle in which the forces of God would eventually win out. And that thinking, along with the national memory of the Jewish triumph over the Seleucids in the Maccabean revolt, it led the Jews to start some really, really ill-advised wars with Rome, all of which ended in complete disaster. And so the people who were putting the canon together said, look, this apocalyptic stuff, it's poison. Let's just get rid of it. We're not going to have anything to do with it. And at least the rabbis pushed it aside, and the Christians kind of scooped it up. And that is where a lot of our end-time thinking comes from. It's not biblical, but a lot of it does come from some of those pseudepigraphic works that survived. So we're just going to have to, last week, have to leave the wild and woolly world of Enoch for something much more sedate, but no less remarkable, which is the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees shares something with Enoch. Like Enoch, it was eventually rejected by both rabbinic and Christian authorities, but it survived on the fringe, once again, in Ethiopic, which was itself translated from Hebrew into Greek, and then from Greek into Ethiopic. It was thought by most Jewish scholars to be a Christian forgery right up until the 1950s, when the book was identified in 5 of the 11 caves of scrolls at Qumran, making it one of the most copied and widespread extra-biblical manuscripts in the Qumran library. There are also what appear to be allusions or quotes from Jubilees in the letters of Paul, Luke, Acts, James, Hebrews, and 2 Peter. It may, in fact, have been one of the more widely read books of the early Common Era, and the interesting thing about this one is that its popularity seems to have transcended factional boundaries. Everybody found something interesting about Jubilees. It wasn't just restricted to one sect or another.
Hey, Sheldon, why is it called Jubilee, Book of Jubilees?
Hold that thought. Jubilees is an example of something we see in intertestamental literature, which is the practice of taking pieces of the original Torah and the early works like Joshua, Judges, and Kings, and tweaking them, their narratives to address contemporary events and concerns. And in the case of Jubilees, it really is a kind of Torah, a major revision of the Pentateuch. Jubilees is structured around the idea of the Jubilee cycle, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, that is 7 times 7 or 49 years, followed by a Jubilee year on the 50th. And appropriately, the book is divided into 50 chapters. So among other things, the Jubilee seeks to repair what it considers to be problems in the traditional Torah. It asserts the authority to do this by claiming that it was written by Moses himself, who went up on Mount Sinai, and in addition to the stone tablets, God had an angel sit with Moses for 40 days and 40 nights and write the book of Jubilees. So this gives it a provenance that is actually stronger than that claimed from the Pentateuch. The book does introduce a few changes, but they are actually pretty modest given the authority, the pretension of authority that it claims for itself. But the author nevertheless ends up rewriting what was supposedly some of the most sacred parts of Jewish scripture to create this parallel Torah. Mind you, he doesn't take things too far. If anything, he wants to protect the original Torah and just shore up those parts that seem inadequate. So one area of concern is the liturgical calendar. That's where we get to the Jubilees thing. He wants to fix the calendar so that the major religious feasts and festivals all fall on the same day of the year. Because traditionally those festivals were, actually they still are, determined by a lunar calendar. So the day, the festivals kind of drift around through the year. And Jubilees insists on rejecting this lunar calendar, and it proposes a solar calendar to determine when the festivals are supposed to happen. Another thing that Jubilees does is it tries to address the question of evil. Now, Jubilees retells the story of the chosen people from the creation to the Exodus. And this is one of the first places where we see a Jewish author treat this problem of evil in any depth. Last week we talked about Philo Judaeus, who was one of the most prolific authors of the intertestamental period. He doesn't go anywhere near this question. He stays way away from it. Jubilees goes there. The author of Jubilees cannot accept the idea that God is responsible for bringing evil into the world. He also rejects the notion that God committed certain things or offered the chosen people various temptations that would lead them into unfaithfulness. The thing is, the God of Genesis through Kings is, or the people of Israel were willing to accept that their God could be capricious, dodgy, and even dangerous to his own people at times. But he's our God, so we just roll with it. In Jubilees, this is no longer acceptable. Apparently, many of God's followers felt that that this just wasn't, we couldn't allow this anymore. Jubilees gets around the problem by inventing a gallery of characters who are active in the world and thus limit God's agency, or I guess you'd say responsibility in the world. These new agents constitute both angels who run God's errands and enforce God's will, and demons who stir up trouble. Now, I have to point out that while the Hebrew scriptures don't have much to say about demons as agents of evil and chaos, we do find extra-biblical and archaeological evidence that indicates that in popular Israelite religion, there was a strong belief in demons and demonic activity. We see things like little things written on walls that are to ward off this evil, or there are demon expulsion bowls where you have a spell that's written in a spiral that moves toward the center, and the idea is that you have some incense burning in the middle, and the demon goes for the incense, but the spell wraps around him and then pops him out. It's kind of that sort of thing. So you've got all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't make it into the actual text. So what Jubilees does is it unifies these demonic creatures into a countervailing force against the will of Yahweh, rather than just going around making mischief. Demons become responsible for evil, and Yahweh is at least partially off the hook. Now we also see Satan in his now familiar role, except that he isn't called Satan. They call him Mastema, the chief of the evil spirits. He's the foe of Yahweh, very nearly his equal. He's the one that tells Abraham that he must offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. He's the one who hardens the hearts of the Egyptians during the Israelite captivity. He's the one that compels them to go pursue them in the desert after they leave. Now, this does not completely absolve God, because Jubilees states explicitly that Mastema operates with Yahweh's permission. In other words, Jubilees only offers a partial solution to the problem of evil and the nature of God, but it's a step forward, I guess. Yes?
Was there just one author, or was this a group project?
Jubilees looks like it's the work of one author, or maybe one really good editor, in this case. Yes?
So would there be some sort of cultural reason for preferring sort of a solar calendar for those holidays as opposed to the lunar, or was it just efficiency?
They're just looking for consistency. I mean, one of the problems too, though, is that some of these festivals are agricultural festivals, and they celebrate certain harvests that come at certain times, but if that harvest doesn't line up, if the calendar doesn't line up with when the harvest actually happens, then you've got a problem. So you've got some practical issues that are going on there too. Okay, so let's move on to the temple scroll. Now, Josephus, he mentions what he calls 3 philosophies, that's his word, among the Jews, although as we know there were many, many more sects. And they were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Of the 3, the Essenes were probably the most exclusive, and the Essene community that occupied the desert sanctuary at Kirbet Qumran was definitely extreme. Interestingly, Josephus claims to have sort of studied with the Essenes for a while, and it looks like he was even thinking about maybe joining that community at one point. Probably better that he didn't, as we shall soon see. Now, among the many documents that were found there in 1946, the Temple Scroll is maybe one of the most remarkable. It was also the last to find its way into the hands, into Israeli hands. Unrolled, it is about 28 feet long and consists of 19 sheets of parchment, all stitched together. The sheets are about 10 inches high and an average of 18 inches wide. There were about 67 columns of text, mostly of 22 lines and some of 28 lines. The reason I use the past tense is because nearly half the scroll was destroyed by humidity as it moldered for at least a decade in a shoebox wrapped in a towel under the floorboards of an Arab antiquities dealer. And in fact, I think this was during the '67 war, Yigal Yadin appointed a special commando unit during the fighting to go into this occupied territory, find this antiquities dealer, get that scroll. They made him an offer he couldn't refuse, but he still came out with a pile of money. They paid him very well for it, from what I understand, but that was probably good that they did that. Okay, so before we go into the scroll itself, some background is in order. The origin of the Qumran community seems to have come about due to a dispute between between the Essenes and the temple hierarchy at the end of the Maccabean revolt. As we mentioned last time, the Maccabee family usurped the high priesthood office from the Zadokite family, which had held that position since the days of Solomon. Even though they had fallen into corruption, the Essenes apparently felt that tradition should prevail. Their leader at that time, the Essene leader, was, we don't have his name, we just have someone referred to in the scrolls as the teacher of righteousness, or more accurately, the correct teacher, but I'm going with teacher of righteousness because it sounds way cooler. At some point, the Essenes were forced or voluntarily retired into the desert rather than submit to a priesthood that was illegitimate in their eyes. Now, I need to take a little tangent here and explain a few things about the place of the temple in Israelite religion. The temple was not just the center of the Jewish cult, it was a cosmic center, the center of the universe, the starting point from which the primordial waters receded from the first emerging land, and therefore the center of all creation. As such, it was also seen as the point from which prosperity, life, fertility of the land, all of it flowed from that point. As a dwelling place for God, it was also the source of all holiness, without which the inhabitants of the land would be in existential danger. A key point was that this vital holiness could be compromised if ritual impurity was introduced into the sacred space. Under an illegitimate priesthood, the Essenes believed that the temple itself, while in some sense sacred, was irredeemably compromised and that the land of Judah itself was in grave danger. So as I mentioned, the Essenes believed that the temple itself could not be redeemed, but it could be replaced. And at some future date, the temple would be destroyed, at which point the Essenes believed that they would be the ones to step in and create a newer, better, legitimate temple. Now this is a drawing of the inner court of the temple as it's described in the temple scroll. This is modeled, the center part here is basically a reproduction of the old Solomonic temple, but then what happens around that is based on a vision of the temple that was given to Ezekiel. It appears in the book of Ezekiel, and they use that as kind of the model to flesh things out. The temple scroll is essentially a blueprint for this process. Like Jubilees, it's a rewrite of the Torah, but in particular it seeks to reconcile the legislation found in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which don't entirely agree with each other. And they try to craft it into a homogeneous whole. Where Jubilees emphasized the festal calendar, the temple scroll is heavily focused on ritual purity. Among other things, the level of purity demanded by the Essenes, at least in the Qumran community, and the future temple, it was similar to the purification that God demanded of the Israelites when they were camped at the base of Mount Sinai. Lord said to Moses, "Go into the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes and be ready against the third day. For the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all people upon Mount Sinai." Incidentally, sanctification in this part of the Bible is kind of a technical term for preparing to enter the presence of God. Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes, and he said, "Be ready against the third day, come not at your wives." So no fooling around. So what are the implications of the Sinaitic rules? They prescribe 2 requirements for the privilege of witnessing of the revelation. First, cleanse yourself of all ritual purity through bathing and laundering. And second, to abstain from sex, which was a ritually defiling act. This later stipulation needs a word of explanation. In the presence of God, as in the temple or Mount Sinai, all ritual impurity is forbidden. A main source of ritual impurity is flow from genital organs. So sex is forbidden in any holy place. The Essenes at Qumran apparently followed a very rigid routine of dietary discipline, reading, studying, copying sacred texts, and the maintenance of purification that included celibacy. But more importantly, they carried out some of the ordinances of the temple related to purification in what appears to have been an effort to maintain at least a nominal level of purity in a surrogate sacred space. I imagine much of this was establishing practices that the community could just step in when it was time to restore the temple. But I also think that what they were doing, that they were doing what they could to, as they saw it, fend off or reduce the consequences to a nation without a legitimate, fully functioning sacred center. The temple scroll also gives instructions on how the new temple is to be built. The structure would be surrounded by a square wall, 1,600 cubits on a side, or nearly half a mile. It would roughly enclose the Ottoman walls that surround the old city today. The overall layout corresponds roughly to the vision of the temple found in Ezekiel, but the central sanctuary would be like the Solomonic model. Now, the purity question in Israelite legislation also concerns just how far that zone of purity extends. In other words, what's the zone that we have to keep ritually pure? In most priestly literature, it's restricted to the temple. Other sections include the entire city of Jerusalem. There's a section in Leviticus known as the Holiness Code that starts in chapter 17 and goes to the end of the book. They maintain that it has to be the entire land of Canaan. For the Essenes, it was Jerusalem proper. One thing we see in their plan for the new temple city is that unlike existing and previous temples, there are no installations for the purification of menstruants. The only conclusion we can draw from this is that women would not live in the new city of Jerusalem, and the men who did live there would be celibate. This maybe gives us an insight into the source of celibate practices that found their way into monastic Christianity. The Essene sect itself was destroyed in the very war that they predicted would destroy the temple. So we can speculate that maybe a few survivors somehow found their way into Christian groups and propounded this idea that sex leads to impurity, and from there it found its way into monasticism. It's just speculation on my part, but it seems reasonable. One last thing. The Temple Scroll gives us an example, well, it gives us many examples, in which the Essenes went far beyond the purity requirements of the rabbis. One of the more interesting, I suppose, is that they considered human feces to be a source of impurity in opposition to the teachings of the rabbis. In other words, no toilets in Jerusalem. But wait, it gets worse. Not only could there be no toilets inside the city, they had to be out of sight of the city, which was about 3,000 cubits from the outer walls. They also held that one could not travel more than a Sabbath day's journey on the Sabbath, which was 2,000 cubits. I'll leave you to work out the math and the implications for yourself. Yes, these guys were that extreme, and in fact Josephus mentions an interesting little passage that kind of confirms this. He talks about how toward the end of the Sabbath, the Essenes in Jerusalem would line up at this little gate that was known as the Essene Gate, but it was also called Bethso, where they would go out to the city in order to do their business after the Sabbath. But this professor of mine realized that Bethso actually could be read Bethsoa, which means the toilet gate. And it would have been just a little tiny opening, this little wicket in the city wall that they could squeeze through one at a time in order to go out and do this thing. So it actually confirms to me that the Temple Scroll is an Essing product. There's a guy I've been reading, Donald Lakinson, who has some doubts about this, but I think he's wrong. I think it really is an Essing document, and this kind of proves it. But this raises a problem with apocalyptic thinking and extremism in general. The Essenes believed that they would be the chosen who survived this long war that would destroy the temple, something that they describe in another document, which is called the War Scroll. They constitute an object lesson when they ignored the teachings of one of their contemporary rabbis, Rabbi Hillel, who warned, do not separate yourself from the community. In fact, the Qumran community was destroyed by the 10th Roman Legion while it was on its way to the siege of Jerusalem. So, yeah, they were right about the temple being destroyed, but not about there being around to pick up the pieces. In times that right now definitely have an apocalyptic vibe to them, we would do well not to insulate ourselves in our churches and our social groups and our ivory towers, assuming that we can escape the turmoil that rages outside. Another thing we learned is the need of each generation to reinterpret and, in a sense, renegotiate how we will respond to the wisdom of Scripture. During the intertestamental period, we see people literally rewriting Scripture and creating alternate Torahs. Today's conventions might consider this to be a dangerous thing, and perhaps it is, but to be honest, it happens a lot anyway when you talk about interpretation of Scripture. In many ways, you have to rewrite Scripture in order to arrive at certain interpretations, rather than just deal with the text itself. But I wonder if sometimes if we might benefit by embracing the innovation and the boldness of their time to take our scriptural inheritance and apply it more vigorously, more creatively to confront the problems that we face in our world. Thank you.
Question. So did most of these writers have the Pentateuch, the Torah as we know it, available to read and then kind of discuss?
Yeah, almost certainly. It was pretty well established by that time, and it was being read in the synagogues, weekly. So they would have.
So it was already established as the authoritative document.
Yeah, it was authoritative, but their idea of canon was a little different from ours. It wasn't quite so circumscribed.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
next week we're going to take a look at some of the books in our own Apocrypha, and I'll also try to point you towards some resources if you're interested in pursuing this stuff, outside of class. So we'll talk about that. And also, if any of you are have a particular work that you're interested in looking at, let me know, or let Father David know, and he'll let me know. So yeah, that's what we'll do. But anyway, thank you for coming. Are there any other questions?
Well, yeah. So I'm curious about this sort of this turn from prophetic to apocalyptic. And it seems that like the prophetic was more community oriented, and it seems like the explanation of evil maybe prior to the temple destruction and Babylon captivity was that all the people had fallen away from God, and then bad things would happen, they'd get conquered, and then they would come back to God, and then they would be restored, and then they would fall away, and then like with the Judges is constantly happening. But it's always the community. It's always, and so, and this turn to apocalyptic, where, like you said at the beginning, it's like the prophetic is like, okay, you can change the future if you reform, the community reforms, but the apocalyptic is more like, okay, this is, bad stuff's gonna happen or whatever's gonna happen, and maybe individuals can change their own fate. And I wondered if there's a parallel in the Greek pagan world where you were talking about how the older interpretation of it was that God, God was capricious and all of these things, and now there's kind of an explanation as God was actually this pure, good, benevolent being, and there were these kind of these side actors that are causing problems. And was there a parallel thing happening in the pagan world as well, where the Greek gods, they were kind of these capricious beings that caused problems and so on. And maybe, I don't know, is it maybe due to Plato, who's got this ideal of the good, the true, the beautiful, these pure things, and so you've got the parallel movement happening in the pagan world as well as in the Jewish world that is sort of maybe somewhat universal.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to try to speak to the pagan world on that. I know that the Zoroastrian ideal tended to demand that God be more, pure and good and righteous, and they really did make a distinction between here's good, here's evil, and what's between them is impermeable. But yeah, you raise a really important point. Prophetic speech is addressed to communities, as you say, and they see evil as systemic. Apocalyptic is addressed to potential survivors, so mostly individuals. This is how you're going to save your tuchus, when it happens. And there's more of a judgment theme too that's coming down that you don't really see in prophetic literature. Yes?
Well, and was the apocalypse something that they thought was going to happen relatively soon? I mean, because I was thinking, if you have this celibate group, you're not expecting to reproduce and live, survive for generations, right? You're expecting the apocalypse to happen soon.
No, they were. It was definitely. I've heard the Essene community of Qumran called a church of anticipation, which I think is a good description. And they did expect this to be happening, if not in their lifetime, then well within the life of the community. It could happen any day, that sort of thing. And given the events that were going on around them, it's easy to understand why they would think that. So any other questions? Yeah.
Well, also, so Gospel of Mark, there's demons everywhere. Jesus is constantly casting out demons. So, do you think Mark had access to these? Was he influenced by these writings?
I think. Well, I would say rather that Mark and these writings were influenced again by Zoroastrian thinking. Ultimately, they were the ones that really start giving this idea that there are all these angels and demons, and that's another thing too, is that in the Old Testament, when you do encounter divine messengers, they're anonymous. We don't. But when you get to the New Testament, I am Gabriel, and I have this message for you, and angels have names and a LinkedIn page and all that stuff. So, okay, well, let's chairs back, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.